What's going on, APUSH? Mr. Majewski's APUSH. It's Mr. M, and I am here to do a very brief summary of the review questions for Thursday's multiple choice. Thursday's multiple choice is going to cover 1790 to 1824, so it's going to cover the Federalist era, and it's going to cover all of Jeffersonian democracy, from Jefferson to Madison to President Monroe. So there's actually a lot there. The test will be about 25 questions, and let's get right into it, okay? So, why were the Bill of Rights and the Judiciary Act of 1789 passed? Immediately by the new Constitution government, by the government after the Constitution was ratified. Okay, well, the Bill of Rights was ratified because that was a promise that Federalists had made to Anti-Federalists in order to get the Constitution passed. So they had promised they would add it immediately once the new Constitution was ratified, and that's exactly what Congress did the first time they got together. Remember, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Since they were all passed together at the same time, they just refer to all 10 of them collectively as the Bill of Rights. Obviously, important amendments that you should know: the First Amendment, right, freedom of speech, assembly, the media or press, all of those are lumped together in one. You should probably be familiar with the 9th and the 10th Amendments, which basically say, especially the 10th Amendment, all powers not delegated to the national government by the Constitution belong to the states. All right. The second major action taken by Congress after the Constitution was the Judiciary Act of 1789. What that did was it basically established our judicial branch. It established what our federal court system was going to actually look like, because the Constitution didn't do that. It just said there would be a judicial branch and there will be a Supreme Court in charge of it, and that was it. So the Judiciary Act, established how many people would be on the Supreme Court. It established what our federal court system was going to look like, and where courts would be located. So these were two things that had to get done immediately once the new Constitution had been ratified, so that the government could actually get to work starting to fix the problems that existed previously under the Articles. Number two, what were the different parts of Hamilton's financial plan, and why did he believe such a plan was necessary? Okay, well, remember the acronym for this is BFAT. So let's go through each of these. B stands for the Bank of the United States. Hamilton believed we needed a bank to hold the country's money, to hold the government's money, and then to be able to loan that money out to Americans who were interested in buying a home or starting a farm or starting a new business. The problem was we had no banking system prior to that, Hamilton said, so we relied on other countries and other countries' banks in order to get funding, when we had plenty of money that our government should be putting into our own banking system, and that's why the Bank of the U.S. was necessary. The second part of the plan, E in BFAT, was the excise tax. The excise tax, remember, was a tax on a non-necessary good. That good was whiskey, because whiskey was a new product that was being distilled along the frontier. It was not being taxed or regulated, and so Hamilton saw an opportunity to tax a good that was not necessary with an excise tax, whiskey, and also, obviously, generate some money for the new government to pay off the debt that it had accumulated. The F in BFAT stands for funding at par. And what that meant was Hamilton said we needed to fund our debts, our bonds, and our loans that we had taken out. We had to fund them with all of the interest, which means we had to pay them back with all interest added on top of it as well. He said we had to do this in order to basically earn the respect of banks and lenders so that we could borrow money in the future when we needed to. So he basically argued, hey, we need to pay off our debts now so that in the future, when we borrow money, we'll be able to actually have access to it. We'll be able to get it. All right? The A in BFAT stood for Assumption of States' Debts. What Hamilton said was, hey, the federal government should take each of the states' individual debts and we should add them all together, make them one big debt, and then we would make that part of the national debt instead of making each state pay their own. He said we needed to do this largely because a lot of these states had gone into debt in order to win the Revolutionary War, and so we as a country owed it to those states to pay for that debt as a whole, rather than making that individual state suffer the burdens of paying it. And finally, the T in BFAT stood for a tariff. It's the Tariff of 1794. It is the first tariff in American history. It was a tariff designed to raise money for the government. So the tariff and the excise tax are designed to raise money because we're horribly in debt after the Articles of Confederation years. The F, funding at par, and the A, the assumption of state debts, were designed to build up our credibility and our credit and our respect with our people and with the rest of the world. And then the B, the Bank of the United States, was designed to obviously give us a bank that we could use to fund all of the activities that Hamilton knew our country needed after the disaster that was the Articles. Jefferson's major objections to these: one, his biggest objection is he's a strict constructionist, so he doesn't think the Constitution gives the government the power to do things like make the bank, all right? So constitutionally, he thinks it's unconstitutional, and that we shouldn't do something that we know is in violation of the Constitution. Hamilton argued it was constitutional because of the elastic clause, because of the necessary and proper clause. Jefferson argued, no, the elastic clause doesn't apply here. This should be unconstitutional. Beyond that, he felt like many of these policies were going to benefit the wealthy. They were going to benefit banks. They were going to benefit manufacturers. They were going to benefit people more in the North. And so Jefferson argued it wasn't fair to the rest of the country to have them go further into debt in order to pay for some of these programs that he argued were only going to benefit some. They were going to benefit the wealthier groups. They were going to benefit banks and merchants and people that lived in the North and along the Atlantic coast. Those were his biggest issues that he had with it. He had a problem with the assumption of state debts as well, because his home state, Virginia, had paid off their debts from the Revolutionary War. And he argued it was unfair to Virginia and fellow southern states to have to pay Massachusetts and other northern states' debts after the war. Ultimately, remember, Washington sides with Hamilton on all 5 of these issues. Washington and Congress does. And so ultimately, all 5 parts of the BFAT plan end up becoming law. Number 3, what was the significance of the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville? By the way, can I go back to 2 really quickly? The debate over the bank, as well as the debate over Jay's Treaty, are the 2 primary reasons why the first 2 political parties form. All right. Number 3, what was the significance of the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville? Okay, so the Battle of Fallen Timbers is when American troops are able to defeat native armies in the Northwest Territory, in what will later become known as the Ohio River Valley. By doing this, they're able to defeat these armies, and they are able to force these native populations to sign the Treaty of Greenville. What the Treaty of Greenville said was that all of the natives in the eastern 2/3 of the Northwest Territory, they had to leave. They had to go westward. That would open up all of that land to permanent American settlements without the risk or the worry of having Indians raiding or slowing down that expansion. It's a big victory. It clears open a lot of the western frontier for American settlement, and it's kind of another sign that the U.S. is able to protect itself and defend itself under the new Constitution, where the Articles had not given them the ability to stop these Indian threats. All right, number 4, why did Washington issue the Neutrality Proclamation, and how was it received by both parties? Well, Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation because he argued that the United States was not in a position to support either England or France in their Revolutionary Wars, I should say their Napoleonic Wars, that occurred in the 1790s and the 1800s. Washington says, hey, I know we have a treaty with France, but an alliance with France, I should say, But, he said, we're weak. We're just getting started ourselves, and we're trying to recover from some of the problems under the Articles. So if we got into a war with one of these two countries, it would devastate us as a nation. And so even though he was sympathetic to the French, because we did have an alliance with them, ultimately he argued we needed to stay neutral, and that's what he ordered our country to do. How was it received by both parties? Well, obviously, Jeffersonians were bothered by it, right? Because we did have technically an alliance with France, who had helped us during our own revolution, and the Jeffersonians argued that perhaps we owed it to France to do the same. The Federalists were generally happy with this decision. Would they have liked us to join Britain? Sure, but that was a long shot, and it seemed more likely that we might side with France. So when Washington orders neutrality, Federalists considered that to be a victory. They'd rather be neutral than on the side of France against Britain in one of these major conflicts. Number 5, I should say. What was the Whiskey Rebellion and what was its significance? Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion by whiskey distillers, the people that were making the whiskey, in reaction to the excise tax that had just been passed as part of Hamilton's plan. Of course, they rose up in opposition to the government. They threatened rebellion. They used a lot of the language or the terms of the Revolution, the American Revolution, to try to compare it to that. Ultimately, remember, Washington and Hamilton send the army there to defeat the Whiskey Rebellion, and it is immediately stopped. What was the significance of it? Well, it showed to people that the government under the Constitution now had the strength, it had the power to be able to stop these challenges, these threats to it, unlike the Articles government had with Shays' Rebellion, when the government was really unable to stop it for months and months and months. So, hey, under this new Constitution, the government finally has the authority it needs to do its job. Number 6, what advice did Washington provide in his farewell address to the nation? Well, one, I wouldn't say this was during the farewell address, but remember, he established that tradition of running for 2 terms. After 2 terms, he said, enough's enough. I don't want to appear like a king-like figure or a monarch. I'm going to go home. Two terms of 8 years is enough. And remember, a lot of presidents afterwards follow in his footsteps. What did he warn us about, or what advice did he give? Well, one, he said, avoid entangling alliances. And everybody knew what that meant. Avoid alliances with European countries. We'll honor what we have, he said, but let's not sign any new ones. We do not want to get dragged into European conflicts that otherwise would have nothing to do with us. His second bit of advice was, he said, political parties are bad, that we should avoid forming political parties because they were bad for democracy and they hurt the country. Obviously, his advice was not heeded because political parties were already starting to grow in strength. He also had a few more general things. He said we needed to respect the Constitution. We needed to follow the rule of law. All right, so follow the laws, respect the Constitution. That was basically his big bits of advice that he gave as part of that farewell address. Now, please remember, the very fact he gave a farewell address is technically another precedent that he is establishing, because other presidents will follow what he has started. Number 7, define both loose and strict construction and which party supported each. Okay. So loose construction means that you think the Constitution is just kind of an outline. It's just a general framework. And it's not to be taken literally. That the framers didn't intend to put every single power in that Constitution that they had. Otherwise, it would have been a humongous document. It would have been almost unreadable. And that there are certain powers, a loose constructionist would say, that Congress and the government has that are not specifically listed in the Constitution. One of them, for instance, would be the authority to make a bank. All right? Federalists tended to be loose constructionists. They believed the federal government, the national government, needed a lot of authority to make the decisions that it needed to make for the country. Strict construction is the opposite of that. Strict construction basically meant that you believed the Constitution should be taken strictly or literally. What I mean by that is you believed that the Constitution specifically listed the powers that the government had and that specifically Congress had, and that they had no other powers beyond that. If it wasn't listed in the Constitution as a power for the national government, then it belonged to the states instead. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were strict constructionists. They did not want the national government to be too large. They were fearful of that, remember? Because many common people felt like a powerful central government would use that power and that authority to potentially to abuse the rights of the lower classes. Number 8, describe the significance of both Jay and Pinkney's treaty. Why was Jay so controversial? Okay, so Jay's treaty was a treaty that we signed, the U.S. signed with Great Britain while Washington was president. And it was designed to try to stop British harassment of Americans, to stop the harassment of American ships, to stop Britain encouraging Indian attacks along our western frontier. More importantly, it was really just designed to make sure the U.S. and Britain didn't spiral into a war. Because Britain was encouraging these attacks on our frontier and encouraging these raids on our ships on the ocean, on the open ocean, a lot of folks believed that that might end up resulting in an actual declared war. So before that could happen, John Jay is sent over by Washington to negotiate the deal. It does maintain our peace. It keeps the peace with Britain, and that was the most important thing. But if you remember, Jay is unable to get the British to really agree to anything else. They do not agree to stop the Indian harassment. They do not agree to stop raiding our ships. And so when he comes back to the United States, a lot of people criticize him and they criticize Washington for a bad treaty. Ultimately, the point of Jay and Washington is, hey, the treaty is primarily designed to get us to help us avoid war, and that's what we did. But a lot of Democratic Republicans especially criticize this treaty and criticize Jay for signing it and Washington for supporting it. And because they felt like we were just giving up too much. All right. By the way, like I mentioned earlier, Jay's treaty is the foreign policy issue that causes the first two political parties to form. It was the bank as the domestic issue and Jay's treaty as the foreign policy issue that were the primary reasons why the first two parties formed. All right. Pinkney's treaty was better. That was a treaty with Spain. And if you remember what it did was it guaranteed American access to the Mississippi River permanently from this point forward. So we didn't have to worry about Spain cutting off the river and or the port of New Orleans any longer. Basically, Spain agreed to give up their claims to some of our western lands. So it was a good treaty for the United States because we got a lot without giving up anything. And so Americans tended to support it. Not only do we guarantee our access to the Mississippi River out west, but we also got Spain to drop those claims to the western United States. All we had to do was basically agree to be friendly with Spain in the future. So back to the second part of number 8. Why was Jay's treaty so controversial? It was controversial because it felt like we were giving up a lot and we really weren't getting anything in return. Remember, we agreed to pay back our debts to Britain from before the Revolution. They didn't agree to stop the harassment, either on the open oceans or on our western frontier. And so a lot of Americans argued, hey, we're giving up too much and we're really not getting enough in return. All right. Number 9, what was the Quasi-War and the XYZ affair? Okay, so we've now switched, beginning with question 9, over to Adams's presidency. The Quasi-War was an unofficial, undeclared war fought between the United States and France that went on for almost 2 years. And it had to do with the fact that we had not supported France in their wars with Britain. Because we didn't support France, even though we had an alliance with them, France got upset with us about this. And they started to raid our ships and harass our ships on the open ocean. We sent over diplomats to Paris to try to get them to stop this harassment. Instead, what happened was the XYZ affair. Our diplomats were approached by 3 men who demanded money. before we could even meet with the French government. These guys identified themselves as X, Y, and Z. The American diplomats refused to pay the bribe. They instead went home and informed the American public about what had happened. And as a result, it led to anti-French war hysteria in this country, where Americans started to clamor for an actual declaration against France. Well, hey, even though he was a Federalist and he wasn't a really big fan of France, he supported Britain more than France, Adams knew a war with France at this time would be disastrous. So instead, what he did on his own was he ordered a new ambassador to be appointed and to go to France and to end up resolving this Quasi-War. He got France to sign something called the Convention of 1800. What that did is France agreed to stop the harassment of American ships in exchange, well, not in exchange, but as well, our official alliance, the Franco-American alliance, was officially canceled. We were no longer obligated to honor it, so therefore, there was no reason for France to pick on us any longer. What political impact did this have on President Adams? His Federalist Party turned on him, remember, because they kind of wanted war with France. So they were kind of excited about the Quasi-War and the XYZ affair, and then their own Federalist president, Adams, stopped it and supported a peace treaty. And so as a result, Hamilton and other members of the Federalist Party, who called themselves High Federalists, refused to support Adams in the election of 1800 and actively worked against him to try to prevent him from winning the presidency. Number 10, why were the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by the Adams government, and what did both laws do? All right. Well, they were passed by the government because President Adams and his administration were being criticized. They were being criticized for his handling of the Quasi-War. His presidency was being criticized by the media, by Democratic, Republican newspapers, and he wanted it to stop. He thought it was bad for him. He thought it was bad for the government. He thought it was bad that the people were constantly being exposed to this negative news about him. And so he and Congress were able to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. What the Alien Act did was, if you remember, it increased the amount of time before a foreign person could become a citizen. This meant it would increase the time before that person could vote in elections. Why? Because remember, most of the foreign citizens that were becoming citizens were joining the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists were noticing they were slowly becoming outnumbered day by day by day, and so they wanted to slow that process down to give themselves more of a chance in future elections to win. The Sedition Act, remember, sedition is opposition to your government. The Sedition Acts, remember, they banned criticism of the president, criticism of the government, even criticism of the flag. And if you were found guilty of any of these things, you could be thrown in jail or fined. Remember, the only people that were ever found guilty under the Sedition Acts were Democratic Republican newspaper editors who had dared to criticize President Adams, and for that criticism, they were thrown in the slammer. Ultimately, these laws are both going to either expire or be replaced when President Jefferson took over in 1800. Number 10, why were the Alien and Sedition Acts passed? I'm sorry, number 11, what were the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and why were they passed? Well, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were passed in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. When the federal government passed the Alien and Sedition, Jefferson and Madison both wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. They wrote them as ghostwriters because they didn't want to know who was actually responsible for writing these attacks on the Alien and Sedition Acts. These resolutions, one was picked up by the state government of Kentucky, the other was picked up by the state government of Virginia. They passed them, and both of them argued that if enough states disagreed with a law, that the states could overrule it or overturn it, even if Congress and the Supreme Court wouldn't do it themselves. This became known as nullification. So Jefferson and Madison are claiming that states can nullify federal laws, which isn't true, but they believed it should be true. And so to them, that was the way for the states to try to get rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Even though Kentucky and Virginia passed these resolutions, no other states did. And so ultimately, the Alien and Sedition Acts had to be overturned by Jefferson after he became president. All right? Number 12, be able to identify the political beliefs of the Federalists and the Democrats. And in order to answer this question, you really need to go to the Federalist era notes, beginning on page 6, and moving into page 7. We'll start with the Federalists. The Federalists were generally folks who lived in the northern states, especially the Northeast. We'd call that New England. They generally believed that government should be run by the upper classes. They said the best people. They argued that richer, wealthier people, upper classes, had more money and therefore more leisure time to study the problems the government had. They had more intelligence and access to education. They were more cultured. They owned property, and so therefore they ought to be the ones making the decision that affected that property. They distrusted common people, the Federalists did. They thought common people were kind of uneducated. They thought that common folks would solve problems a lot of times with force or with violence instead of with rationality and reason. They believed democracy was just too important to be left up to the common people, who they thought would make a mess of it. They did support a much stronger central government, Federalists did. That's why they wanted the national government to have so much power. They thought that it needed to be able to maintain law and order, and that it needed to be strong enough to respond to challenges to it, like Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion. They also thought that a strong government would better protect people's lives and property. And they believed also that the federal government's job was to help businesses to grow, not to tax or regulate them. It made sense because Federalists owned a lot of the businesses in this country. They were the merchants, they were the manufacturers, they were the shippers, they were the people that lived in urban areas, they were people that lived along the Atlantic coastline. We call that the Eastern Seaboard. They were the ones who benefited the most from commerce and manufacturing, and so they wanted the government to do everything it could to support those industries. They were very pro-British in their beliefs. They thought that we had very common similarities with Britain. We spoke the same language. We were the same culture. And they argued that it made sense for us to become closer to Britain, our traditional cultural ally, and to try to model ourselves kind of after their government. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, advocated rule of the people, government for the people, not by the people. They still thought wealthy people should rule, but on behalf of the common man. They believed that the common people were wise. They believed common people would make the right choices, and that they could be taught to become good citizens. The Democratic Republicans appealed to the middle class. They appealed to middle-class Americans. They appealed to yeoman farmers, so farmers, small farmers who own their land. They appealed to laborers, workers who did not own any land. They appealed to small shopkeepers and small artisans, which would be peeps who are making products themselves by hand. They were supported by the lower and middle classes, whereas the Federalists were supported by the upper classes. Democratic Republicans believe in states' rights. They believe the state should have all the authority other than what the Constitution gave to the national government. They believed the federal government should be small, that it should not have a lot of wealth, that it should only have the power to do what it needed to do and not anything beyond that. They called it a limited government, and they were big supporters of it. That's why they were strict constructionists, because they wanted to limit the authority, the power, the control that the national government had. They, remember, wanted to pay off the national debt as quickly as possible, and they did not want us to add to our debt, which meant we should only spend the money that we have. We should not make decisions that caused us to get further into debt. That's one of the reasons why Jefferson opposed some of Hamilton's financial plan. Democratic Republicans were mostly farmers. They were supported by farmers. They themselves generally were planters or farmers. They did not want special privileges for groups like manufacturers. They saw farming as the key to this country. Since most of us were farmers at the time, they argued that should be the group that we should protect the most. They believed in freedom of speech as a way to keep the government in check, as a way for the government to respect the rights of the people. We needed to have freedom of speech and freedom of the press to expose the government whenever it was tyrannical. And of course, they were pro-French in their beliefs. They supported the democratic ideals of the French Revolution, and they pointed out that France had helped us during our revolution, and those were reasons why we ought to be more friendly with them for political reasons. So that's the real differences between the two parties when they formed. That helps to explain why they were so different from one another and why they clashed so often with each other. Number 13, describe why some people classified Jefferson's victory as the Revolution of 1800. Well, it was considered revolutionary because Jefferson represented the masses. He represented the common people. And so now he wins the presidency in 1800. His party won Congress as well, and so it was viewed as a major shift from the Federalist view of governing on behalf of the upper class to now government on behalf of the common people, which was a revolutionary idea, a very democratic idea. It was also revolutionary, remember, because it was the first time that there had been a change from one party to another in our government. Shoot, it was the first time it had ever happened in history. And so, a lot of folks considered that to be a revolutionary change when the Federalists peacefully stepped down and allowed the Democratic Republicans to take over the White House and Congress as well. 14, what was the significance of Marbury v. Madison? Marbury v. Madison's significance is that it significantly boosted the authority of the judicial branch. It gave the Supreme Court the power to use judicial review, which meant the court could now review every decision passed by Congress to check whether it was constitutional, and if the court said it wasn't, then the court could strike that law down and invalidate it. That massively boosted the power and the authority of the judicial branch. It really made it kind of the equivalent of the other two branches. And, of course, why did this happen? Well, because, remember, the Federalists were in control of this branch. They had lost the other two, and so they saw this as a way for them to still be able to influence the government and to be able to boost the authority of the government by making decisions that took away from states' rights and by supporting decisions that gave greater authority to the federal government. So judicial review created by Marbury, considered by many to be the most important decision in Supreme Court history. 15, who was the most important Chief Justice in history? That was a guy named John Marshall. Marshall was responsible for the Marbury decision. He was a strong Federalist, a big believer in the power of the federal government and of the Supreme Court. He's considered most important because he made decisions over and over and over again that boosted the authority of the court, and more importantly, boosted the authority of the national government over the states. All right, so Marshall was hated by Jeffersonians because he kept making decisions that seemed to benefit loose construction and that seemed to give greater and greater authority to the national government compared to the states. Number 16, what was the Louisiana Purchase and how did the U.S. manage to sign it? It was the acquisition of a massive amount of land out west. We bought it from France. Remember, we paid $15 million for the massive purchase that nearly doubled this country in size. It was a steal. It was the deal of the century. Why did it happen? Well, remember, we wanted to try to buy New Orleans from France, whom Spain had given New Orleans to France. And so we wanted to buy it from France now. And we went over, offered $10 million, and Napoleon stunned us when he came back and offered us all of Louisiana instead. Of course, we know why Napoleon did that. He wanted to focus on his war in Europe and not be distracted by overseas possessions like he had just experienced in Haiti because of that Haitian Revolution that occurred there. What were the impacts of the Lewis and Clark expedition that followed? Well, remember, Lewis and Clark mapped out the Louisiana Territory. They claimed large portions of it for the United States so that in the future, that's going to increase our claims to the Oregon Territory out west when other countries like England tried to claim it too. They developed relationships with some native tribes. They took a bunch of biological samples of what was out there, and that's it. All right, they mapped it out. They kind of befriended some of the native tribes. They collected biological samples, and they boosted our claims to some of these territories later on when other countries are going to try to dispute them. Number 17, what was the Tripolitan War and what was the significance of it? The Tripolitan War is the term we use to describe the Americans finally being able to defeat the Barbary States. The Barbary States pirates had been harassing us since the 1780s, into the 1790s, and then also the early 1800s. President Jefferson orders the American Navy over to North Africa. One by one, we are able to defeat the Barbary States, starting with Tripoli, hence the term the Tripolitan War. By 1815, we had finally stopped the harassment by the Barbary States of American merchant ships. What's the significance? Again, another sign that the U.S. is becoming stronger, is in a position now to better respond to these challenges, not just domestic challenges like Shays' Rebellion, but here, foreign challenges from countries like the Barbary States. Number 18, what were the major grievances the U.S. had with Great Britain leading up to the War of 1812? Oh my goodness. Okay, 1. The British are raiding American ships, and most importantly, they're then capturing American sailors and impressing them into service with Britain. So they're forcing American sailors to fight for Britain. Many of these sailors end up being killed in combat against their will. They're being forced almost like slaves to serve. So our ships are being raided. Our soldiers, our sailors are being impressed. The British, if you remember, refused to abandon those western forts and then continued to encourage Native American raids from those forts by giving the local Native Americans food, weapons, and ammunition. Those are the 3 biggest complaints we had. Now, specifically, remember, the British are going to pass something called the Orders in Council, which tried to force us to trade with them first before we would be allowed to go on to Europe and trade with the rest of Europe. If we did not follow that rule, our ships could be attacked and our cargo could be seized. So those are the major grievances. Harassment on the open seas, impressment of American troops, all right, of American sailors, and Orders in Council, which, if you remember, forced us to trade with England first before we could trade with any other countries in Europe, specifically France. Number 19, what were the Orders in Council? I just described those. And the Berlin and Milan decrees. Remember, after the British passed the Orders in Council, Napoleon and France responded by passing the Berlin and Milan decrees, which basically said if we traded with England first, we would be banned from doing any trade in any European port whatsoever. At this time, the British controlled the oceans and France controlled the European continent. So we're stuck in the middle. If we follow the Orders in Council, France is not going to trade with us, Europe won't trade with us, and French ships would harass and attack us if they saw us on the open ocean. If we followed the Berlin and Milan decrees, then England's going to raid our ships. They're going to seize our cargo. They're going to sink our ships and impress our sailors. So no matter which side we traded with or supported, ultimately we were going to be retaliated against by the other side. What effects did this have on the United States? Well, we're going to get to that on question 21 when we get to the Embargo Act. Number 20. What was the Chesapeake Leopard incident and what effect did it have on the American public? Okay. Chesapeake Leopard was an incident that occurred between an American ship and a British warship. The American ship, the Chesapeake, was carrying what were believed to be smuggled goods, and the Leopard believed, the British crew believed, that the Chesapeake was hiding escaped British sailors on their ship. What those really were would have been impressed American sailors. And so the Leopard demanded that the Chesapeake let them board and search their cargo and search their crew to see if there were any American sailors who the British believed ought to be serving on their ships. When the Chesapeake captain refused to let the British board the ship, The British fired at point-blank range. A handful of Americans were killed and wounded. What effect did this have? This whipped the American public up into an anti-British hysteria. So just like the XYZ had whipped the American public up into an anti-French hysteria when Adams was president, now the Chesapeake Leopard incident whips the American public up into an anti-British hysteria. Americans want revenge. We want retaliation. Of course, President Jefferson is really forced to start to build up the American Navy as a response. What reasons was the Embargo Act passed, and what effect did it have on the U.S. economy? Okay. Jefferson did not want to go to war with England because he knew, just like Washington and Adams before him, that that would be devastating for our fledgling little country. So what he did instead was try to pass the Embargo Act, and Congress went ahead and passed this. Remember, what it said was, we are no longer going to trade with any other country in the world. We're not going to get trade with Britain. We're not going to trade with France. We're not going to trade with anybody else. We're not going to get dragged into their conflict because when Britain and France realized how important American trade was, they would stop their harassment of us, and they would go back to allowing us to trade freely with both sides. So yeah, the Embargo Act was going to hurt us because we're voluntarily not going to trade with the rest of the world. But Jefferson argued it was necessary in order to get Britain and France to stop their harassment, because Britain and France would be so harmed by us cutting off trade with them that they would stop their harassment of our ships. Of course, that did not happen. If you remember, instead, Britain and France do not suffer from this policy. We did. We hurt our own economy. We restricted our own trade intentionally. If you remember, it led to smuggling by Americans in opposition to their own government's laws. It led to a massive panic of 1807 and a depression where we, kind of on our own, stopped our trade. And when that happened, our economy spiraled downward. We no longer had that millions of dollars of trade revenue every year. And so we sunk into a short-term depression. What new policy did Madison work to pass when he became president? Well, remember, the Embargo Act technically was passed at the end of Jefferson's presidency, so Madison takes over. We're in the middle of a depression because of it. He gets rid of that Embargo Act, and Madison then worked to get the Non-Intercourse Act passed, which said we will trade with the rest of the world, we just won't trade with Britain and France. And then later on, Madison was able to get something called Macon's Bill No. 2 passed, which said that we will trade with Britain and France, whichever country stops their harassment first, we will trade with them and only them. By the time that the Non-Intercourse Act and Macon's Bill 2 had been passed, we were already on our way to war with England, and so there really, quite frankly, was no way to avoid it by that point. Number 22, who were war hawks? Name their two biggest leaders and what policies they supported. War hawks were Western and Southern congressmen, young, new congressmen, representing new states, especially those out west. They were led by Henry Clay, the Kentuckian who represented the West, and John C. Calhoun, the Southerner. And they both advocated aggressive expansion. They wanted war with England in order to perhaps capture Canada and to get back at England for what they considered to be this harassment and mistreatment by the British of us. And they actually, some of them, supported war with Britain because they thought Spain would get involved in that conflict and we might be able to seize not only Canada, but potentially Florida as well. So they're young, brash, energetic congressmen. They very strongly believe in American nationalism and American expansion, and they want us to go to war. Not only with Britain, but also they wanted us to remove all natives along the western frontier as well, to open up that land to future American settlement. Number 23, what were the names of the Indian leaders who led Shawnee Indian opposition against Western expansion? So right at about the time the War of 1812 starts, that's when we deal with Tecumseh and the Prophet, the brothers who were responsible for leading those Indian attacks and those raids along our western frontier. They united a bunch of tribes in opposition to us. And so the Americans are forced to send an army out to the western frontier to defeat Tecumseh. They do so at a place called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And the American general responsible for that was a guy named William Henry Harrison. He becomes one of the two famous members of the War of 1812, along with Andrew Jackson. In fact, Harrison's nickname, because of this battle, from this point forward, was simply just Tippecanoe. So William Henry Harrison defeats Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison becomes a hero. Tecumseh and the remaining Indians on the frontier are defeated, and most of them are forced to move west past the Mississippi River, which opened up even more western territory to American expansion. Number 24. What was the Hartford Convention? Why was it formed? The Hartford Convention occurred during the War of 1812. It was formed by Federalists who were seeing their popularity continue to diminish, continue to shrink. Why did they form it? To express their opposition to the War of 1812. They thought that if they went to the government and explained to the government their complaints, that the government might address some of their grievances in order to get them to support the war more fully. Their biggest arguments, remember, were that the war was hurting them financially. It was destroying New England's economy because they depended so much on trade with Britain. Ultimately, they sent a list of demands to Washington, D.C., to try to get their demands met. None of those demands ended up being met. In fact, instead, we signed the Treaty of Ghent shortly afterwards, and so many of these Federalists ended up being portrayed as un-American, as against the war, and as interested in their own self-interest. What significance does it have on the Federalists? It sped up the demise of their party. It caused more and more people to leave the party or to lose their support for it. And so as time goes by, the Federalists lose even more of the limited support that they still were holding on to. It's one of the reasons why the Federalist Party falls apart in 1816. 25. What was the greatest victory and greatest loss of the U.S. during the War of 1812? The greatest victory is the Battle of New Orleans, which makes Andrew Jackson a household name. It propels him to incredible popularity. It also gives the Americans a sense of victory and success at the end of the war. Of course, we know it technically was fought after the war was over, but whatever. Our greatest loss during the War of 1812 was when the British captured Washington, D.C., and burned the White House to the ground. That was an embarrassing loss. That was a symbolic loss, because what better symbol of this country existed at this time than the White House? And so to see the president and his wife running away from it, to see the British burning it to the ground, was a real big kind of insult. It was a major loss. Fortunately, we rebounded, we were able to win the Battle of New Orleans, and ultimately we were able to get the British to agree to a peace deal. Speaking of which, number 26, what were the terms of the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812? Very simple. The terms were that both sides would go back to their pre-war boundaries, and that none of the issues which had caused the war would be resolved at that time. Basically, both sides simply agreed to stop the fighting, to end the war, and to go back to how things were before the war started. Now, you might say to yourself, dang, that's a disaster for the U.S. They got none of the things accomplished that they had hoped. Ironically enough, after the war was over, now that Britain started to treat us with a little bit more respect after withstanding them a second time, Britain began to negotiate peacefully with us, and many of these previous issues ended up getting resolved at the negotiation table instead. Number 27, describe the American system and why Henry Clay believed it was necessary. So the American system is Henry Clay's plan to continue to build our economic system. He argued there were three things the country desperately needed after the War of 1812. The acronym for this, remember, is BIT, B-I-T. He argued we needed a new Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the U.S., as it becomes known, because the first one's charter had run out. It was no longer in business. It only lasted for 20 years. And so he argued we needed another 20-year charter for a second Bank of the United States. We're going to give it more wealth. We're going to give it more authority over our economic system. We're going to give it more money to loan out to Americans who need it to help the country grow. The second part of the American system were internal improvements. He argued we needed the national government to spend money to build roads, railroads, canals, anything that would physically link the regions of the country together. He thought that it would cause there to be more trade. He thought that there would be more movement of people from one region to another. And he thought it would almost be like a glue that would, almost like an infrastructure, like our skeletal system, that would physically link the regions of the country closer together and make Americans feel like they were more of one country instead of 3 different regions or a bunch of different states. It's considered economic nationalism when you pass laws to try to bring the nation, economic laws to try to bring the nation together more economically. The last part of the, and by the way, internal improvements never were achieved. Remember, they were vetoed by Democratic Republican presidents. And so despite Clay's best efforts, this is the part of the American system, the internal improvements, that he was never able to officially get implemented. The third part of the American system is a tariff, the higher protective tariff of 1816. He argued we didn't just need a tariff for money anymore, like Hamilton had argued. Now we actually needed a tariff to protect American manufacturing. Clay argued that the British were flooding our markets with their products for cheap, and that we needed, Americans couldn't compete, and we needed a tariff on foreign goods that foreign companies would have to pay, so they'd have to raise their prices when they sold goods in the United States, so that the American public would be more likely to buy the American good instead, and help out their fellow American business. Clay also argued the tariff would raise more money for the government, which could then be used to build those roads and the other improvements that he argued we needed. What was the greatest political obstacle to getting the system put in place? It was the Democratic Republican presidents of the time, who were strict constructionists, didn't believe internal improvements were constitutional, and so they vetoed those measures when Congress passed them. What were some examples of, 28, what were some examples of early United States nationalism that emerged after the war? Folks, I'm really going to get into those in tomorrow's class, and so I will, it's the things like American Dictionary and McGuffey's Readers. These are things that were produced after the war that were designed to educate Americans while at the same time reinforcing American patriotism as well. I'll talk more about those in class tomorrow if I have not already. Number 29, what were the major artistic and literary movements in the U.S. during and after the War of 1812? Again, number 29 I will cover in class tomorrow. Number 30, what were the major foreign policy achievements of the United States during the era of good feelings? Okay, well, one, we are able to pass 2 different agreements with England under President Madison and Monroe. The first one was the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which disarmed our border with Canada, so there was less likelihood that conflict would break out between the U.S. and Britain in Canada any longer. And then the next year, the Convention of 1818, that solidified what our boundary would be with Canada, so that we would no longer have any future boundary disputes between the two. Our boundary officially became the 49th parallel with Canada, and so from this point forward, as both sides expand westward, we didn't really have to worry about what belonged to whom. So those are both considered good achievements for the Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, in his negotiations with Britain. We also, at the time, signed the Florida Purchase Treaty. Remember, the Florida Purchase Treaty was signed by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. We acquired Florida in exchange for buying Florida from Spain, we promised to drop our claims to Texas. So Spain agreed to sell us Florida. They really didn't have much choice. They were worried about losing it anyways down the road. And if you remember, Andrew Jackson already had his army in Florida because he was chasing Indians who had fled across the boundary into Florida anyways. So ultimately, because of Jackson, the Spanish are willing to agree to the Florida Purchase Treaty. Our last major foreign policy achievement under the era of good feelings was the Monroe Doctrine. Remember what the Monroe Doctrine said was that the United States would no longer tolerate any new European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So basically, it's our announcement to Europe, hey, North and South America are off limits from this point forward. If you already have colonies here, Europe, you can keep them. But don't try to expand them, and don't try to build any new ones, or we'll consider that an attack upon the United States, and we reserve the right to destroy that colony and to stop that expansion. It's supposed to be an announcement by the United States that we feel strong enough to actually kind of defend and stand up for our region of the world. This was especially important because there were many Latin American democratic revolutions that were starting at this time. Europe was trying to stop those democratic revolutions. We obviously wanted to see them succeed, so the Monroe Doctrine was designed to try to prevent European interference in Latin America from this point forward. All right. What was the primary cause and major impact of the Panic of 1819? Primary cause, if you remember, was over-speculation of Western lands. Banks behaved badly. They gave loans out to people they should not have. When some of those people started to struggle to pay those loans back, the banks foreclosed on a lot of those homes and farms out west. Because of that, we experienced an economic decline. And of course, that led us into a depression, commonly known as a panic, this time the Panic of 1819. So over-speculation of our lands out west by banks, bad loans by banks, and then a real shortage of gold and silver called specie resulted in this panic occurring. By the way, from this point forward, we're going to get panics about every 20 years. So it was almost like a cycle of economic growth followed by a short panic that would bring us down at the end of each 20 to 25 year interval. Number 32, describe and identify the significance of both the Missouri Compromise and the Monroe Doctrine. Missouri Compromise, if you remember, was a policy that maintained the balance in Congress between free and slave states. If you recall, slavery is reignited as an issue following the Missouri Compromise. Missouri wanted to become a state. It was going to be a slave state. Southerners wanted that, Northerners did not, because that would give the Southerners a majority in the Senate. Ultimately, Henry Clay is able to engineer a compromise where Missouri was made a slave state, and then the new state of Maine was created in the north. That would be a free state. That meant that the 12-12 balance in the Senate would be maintained. It was considered a temporary solution to the larger problem of slavery. What it does is it reignites the slavery issue in this country. It makes Southerners become fearful that slavery might be taken away, especially since the North actually had tried to do that at first. They passed something called the Tallmadge Amendment, which would have made Missouri a free state. It was blocked by Southerners, and then Southerners became defensive of slavery from this point forward. They start to vote together, and they start to become convinced that over time, Northerners are going to reduce and eventually eliminate slavery in this country. I already talked about the Missouri Doctrine, so I don't really need to mention that at this time. Finally, 33, what happened during the election of 1824, and why is it viewed as an end to the era of good feelings? Okay, in 1824, we have 4 different candidates that run for president. Each of them represented different regions of the country. As a result of that election, when John Quincy Adams is elected president, by the House, by the way, Then we start to see the development of new political parties in this country, and so this 8-year period where there was only one party in the country is short-lived. It dies down after the election of 1824. That is the last time we are going to get an election that had just one party running multiple candidates. That's it, folks. Hopefully this helps you out moving forward. Let me know if you have any questions. 58 minutes. I got it in under an hour. I'm kind of proud of myself. You take care. Have a lovely night. Hopefully this helps you as you study for Thursday.